Something strange is happening in Harlem. Black people are disappearing by the thousands. Some people blame rising housing prices, others blame gentrification, and some folks even point to immigration. But what is really happening in Harlem? Today, Scope News decided to take a deep dive into the numbers. Let's take it back to the 1980s. Cameo was all over the radio. Everywhere you went, you could hear, "Word up." You couldn't escape the record. You might see your homegirl heading to the local bodega, or you may stop by Sylvia's for some fried chicken. Another day might be you walking past a church where several generations of the same family had worshipped every Sunday. At the time, Harlem was still one of the most recognizable black communities in America. This was the home of the Harlem Renaissance. It was the neighborhood associated with Langston Hughes and Malcolm X, and countless writers, musicians, activists, athletes, and educators who helped shape Black America during the 20th century. Harlem was also home to the famous Apollo Theater, where generations of great performers graced the stage. If the audience didn't like your act, the legendary Sandman might come dancing across the stage to sweep you right off. Even the Harlem Globetrotters carried the neighborhood's name around the world. For much of the 20th century, Harlem represented the dreams of the Great Migration. Families left the Deep South, places like Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, and other southern states, searching for jobs, safety, opportunity, and the chance to build a better future. Many of them landed in Harlem. By the middle of the 20th century, Harlem had become one of the most influential black communities in the world. At one point, Central Harlem was nearly 98% black. Today, that number is dramatically lower. Let's look at the numbers. By 1950, approximately 98% of Central Harlem's population was black, making it one of the largest concentrations of black people in America. Even in 1980, Central Harlem remained approximately 94% black. But the story had already begun to change. By 2000, Central Harlem was approximately 77% black. By 2021, black residents made up only about 44% of the population. Harlem did not lose its black majority overnight. It happened little by little, decade after decade. The question is why? The easy answer is gentrification. And yes, rising property values, luxury developments, and increasing rents have played a major role. As wealthier residents moved into Harlem, housing costs increased, and many longtime residents found themselves priced out of the neighborhood their families had called home for generations. But that is only part of the story. Many black families also moved to other boroughs, suburbs, and southern cities in search of larger homes, lower costs, safer neighborhoods, and better opportunities. Harlem's black population had already been declining for decades as longtime residents moved away, and new immigrant communities and young professionals entered the neighborhood. The result is a Harlem that is far more diverse than it once was. Latino populations grew. White populations increased. New immigrant communities arrived. Meanwhile, the number of black residents continued to decline. In some parts of Harlem, black residents are no longer the largest demographic group. The irony is hard to ignore. The neighborhood that became famous because of black migration is now experiencing a black migration of its own. Not into Harlem. Out of Harlem. Walk through Harlem today, and you can still find traces of its history. The Apollo Theater still stands. Sylvia still serves food. Murals still celebrate legends. Church bells still ring on Sunday mornings. But the demographics tell a different story. The Harlem that once symbolized Black America's arrival is becoming something else entirely. So, what else could have happened? When Scope News examined Harlem's history, we found that the transformation began long before luxury apartments and expensive coffee shops appeared. One of the first major turning points was economic decline. During the 1960s and 1970s, New York City lost manufacturing jobs. Businesses closed. Unemployment increased. Many middle-class families moved away. Harlem was hit especially hard. Then New York City entered a financial crisis. Buildings deteriorated. Property owners abandoned apartments. Some landlords stopped making repairs. Others stopped paying property taxes and simply walked away. The city eventually acquired enormous numbers of Harlem properties through tax foreclosure. In some sections of Harlem, New York City reportedly came to own approximately 60% of the residential property. because so many private owners had abandoned their buildings. Many of the brownstones people fight over today were viewed as liabilities. Some sold for astonishingly low prices or needed to be completely rebuilt. Others sat vacant for years. Entire blocks fell into disrepair. Then came the heroin epidemic. Soon after, it was crack cocaine as well. By the 1980s, Harlem was making national headlines for crime, addiction, poverty, and abandoned housing. Many residents who had the ability to leave did exactly that. This part of Harlem's history is often missing from modern conversations. Today, people see historic brownstones selling for millions of dollars. What they do not always realize is that some of those same buildings sat vacant or badly damaged only a few decades ago. Many investors wanted nothing to do with them. The properties were considered too expensive to repair, too risky to purchase, or located in neighborhoods that financial institutions had already neglected. That began to change as new groups of buyers entered Harlem. During the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, Caribbean immigrants settled throughout Harlem and nearby communities. Families from places such as Jamaica and Guyana became an increasingly important part of the neighborhood. Over the years, some longtime residents developed the belief that Caribbean immigrants had somehow received special access to Harlem real estate. But the historical record points to a more complicated explanation. Many immigrant families pooled their money. Several relatives might contribute toward purchasing one building. Extra rooms or apartments could be rented out. Multiple generations often lived together. Most importantly, some families were willing to purchase distressed properties that other buyers considered too risky. Researchers have documented that West Indian immigrant families sometimes achieved higher rates of home ownership and asset accumulation than native-born black families. The evidence points more toward differences in timing, financing strategies, family cooperation, and a willingness to purchase buildings that required enormous repairs. Many of these families took serious financial risks at a time when Harlem property was still considered undesirable. Then came another transformation. Wall Street and developers discovered Harlem. Investors made their move too. By the 1990s and early 2000s, people who had once avoided Harlem began describing it as one of Manhattan's last bargains. Property values exploded. Housing prices soared. Luxury developments appeared. Historic brownstones became million-dollar assets. The demographics changed along with the real estate market. In 1990, only a relatively small number of white residents lived in Central Harlem. Over the following decades, that number grew dramatically, while the black share of the population declined. Between 2010 and 2020 alone, Harlem reportedly lost more than 10,000 black residents while gaining nearly 19,000 white residents. The neighborhood's total population grew, but the people whose families had built Harlem increasingly struggled to remain there. This is where the apartment story becomes especially important. For generations, many Harlem families lived in rent-controlled or rent-stabilized apartments. Those apartments became lifelines. A grandmother might move into an apartment during the 1950s or 1960s. Her children might grow up there. Her grandchildren might visit every holiday. After the grandmother passed away, another family member might hope to receive succession rights and remain in the apartment. For many families, these units were more than affordable places to live. They were part of the family's history. At the time, few residents could have imagined how valuable those buildings would eventually become. But as developers, investors, and banks turned their attention toward Harlem, rents increased, property values increased, and the legal protections surrounding these apartments became more important than ever. Local newspapers have documented numerous disputes involving children and grandchildren trying to keep apartments once occupied by their parents, grandparents, or even great-grandparents. Losing one of these apartments often meant losing the family's final connection to Harlem. In one widely discussed case, a Harlem tenant learned that he may have been overcharged for a rent-stabilized apartment for nearly 2 decades. The case attracted attention because it showed how confusing New York's housing system can be. Many tenants do not fully understand the protections attached to their apartments. Some may not know whether their units are legally rent-stabilized. Others may not know how to obtain their apartment's rental history or challenge suspicious increases. These protections can look powerful on paper, but become fragile when tenants do not know they exist or cannot afford a lengthy legal fight. As Harlem became more expensive, longtime residents watched their community change around them. Neighbors moved away, familiar businesses closed, church congregations became smaller, buildings changed ownership. Every year, fewer familiar faces remained. Many people assume immigration was the primary reason Harlem changed. Immigration certainly played a role in making Harlem more diverse. Latino populations grew. White populations increased. New immigrant communities arrived. But one of the biggest factors was the departure of Black residents themselves. Some families moved to the Bronx or Queens. Others relocated to New Jersey or the suburbs. Many left New York entirely. Researchers studying these migration patterns found that Black Americans were increasingly moving towards cities in the South. The children and grandchildren of the Great Migration were participating in what scholars call the reverse Great Migration. Cities such as Atlanta, Charlotte, Houston, Dallas, Raleigh, and Nashville attracted Black families searching for lower housing costs, larger homes, warmer weather, family connections, and new economic opportunities. In other words, Harlem was not simply losing Black residents because other groups were moving in. Harlem was also losing Black residents to other parts of the country. There was another important difference between generations. Earlier Harlem residents could sometimes obtain affordable apartments even when their incomes were modest. Younger generations entered a completely different housing market. Many could not afford to buy the brownstones their grandparents once rented rooms in. They could not afford the newly renovated apartments in the buildings where their parents had grown up. Even those with stable jobs found themselves competing in one of the most expensive housing markets in the country. Some longtime residents left voluntarily in search of better opportunities. Others were pushed out by rising rents, landlord pressure, building sales, lost succession cases, or the disappearance of affordable housing. That is why no single explanation can tell the entire story. So, was Harlem destroyed by crime? Crime played a role. Did the drug epidemic contribute to families leaving? Yes. Did economic decline matter? Absolutely. Did Caribbean immigration change Harlem? Yes. But immigration alone did not cause the decline of Harlem's Black population. Did gentrification play a role? Real estate speculation played a role. The abandonment of buildings played a role. The loss of jobs played a role. Migration to the suburbs was also a part of this decline, and also people relocating to the South. And you cannot forget, the rising housing costs played a major part. And the failure to protect affordable apartments played a part too. Together, these forces help explain why one of the most famous Black communities in American history looks so different today than it did during the Harlem Renaissance or even during the 1980s. Today, Harlem remains one of the most historically significant Black communities in America. Tourists still travel from around the world to experience its history, but the demographic numbers tell a story that many visitors never see. The descendants of the families who built Harlem are becoming a smaller share of Harlem's population. The neighborhood that became famous because Black people moved there is now experiencing a very different migration story. This time, the movement was not from Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, or the Carolinas into Harlem. It was from Harlem to the Bronx, from Harlem to Queens, or from Harlem to New Jersey, and to many other places like the South. Harlem has long been synonymous with Black culture, but a deep dive into census data reveals a neighborhood in the midst of a dramatic demographic shift, moving far beyond the simple narrative of gentrification. And that leaves one difficult question. When the descendants of the people who built a community can no longer afford to live there, who inherits the culture they created? Scope News tells the truth. Here are the facts. Scope News would like to thank the researchers, historians, journalists, and public institutions whose work helped make this report possible. Our research included information from the United States Census Bureau, the New York City Department of City Planning, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, Columbia University's Harlem History Archives, the New York Times, the New York Daily News, Patch Harlem, Humanity in Action, and Housing and Demographic Research published through New York University. We also reviewed research on the Great Migration, the reverse Great Migration, rent stabilization, housing abandonment, immigration, urban development, and Harlem's changing population. Legal disclaimer. This video is intended for educational, historical, and commentary purposes. The information presented is based on publicly available census records, academic research, historical archives, housing records, and news reporting available at the time of production.